sorry, I need to know a little bit about you all before I go any further, before we go any further. How many of you all in here are cruising sailors? Let me see some hands. Okay. How many of you are cruising powerboaters? Okay. How many of you like to fish? Good. How many of you like to eat crabs? Okay. Just checking. How many of you in here own a canoe or a kayak? Good. How many of you are stand-up paddleboards? Anybody? A few? Good. Good. A good spread of people. The Capt. John Smith Chesapeake National Historic Trail started off about 15 years ago around the whole idea of Jamestown's 400th anniversary. You may be able to tell by the way I talk which side of the Potomac River I was born on. We have a joke that Virginia runs on incest and ancestor worship. That's also true to some extent in Southern Maryland. And that's not an accident. It's actually part of what this whole thing was about. It all started with a really wise conservationist named Pat Noonan, first of the Nature Conservancy and then of the founder of the Conservation Fund, who served on an advisory board for the National Park Service and got to thinking around 2002 about Jamestown's 400th anniversary. Virginia has faithfully since 1807 celebrated Jamestown every 50 years. And it has been a celebration right up. I remember the 350th in 1957. This time around, the whole thing was different. It had a different tone to it from the late 90s when Virginia started to plan it, because for the first time they involved the people from the native tribes in Virginia and people from the families of the first Africans brought to America. They were brought to Jamestown in 1619. And indeed, there is a 400th anniversary commemoration of that event going on in Virginia now, as well as commemoration of the first elected body of citizens in North America, which was also begun in Virginia in 1619. But for the reason that they, as you undoubtedly have figured out, the bringing of African Americans to Virginia in 1619 in bondage of one sort or another. There's debate about whether some of them were indentured as opposed to being flat-out slaves. And also the native people who did not have the easiest time over the next 4 centuries. And they were absolutely part of the planning all the way through. So the 2007 anniversary was dubbed a commemoration, not a celebration. And it was really clear-eyed. There was some celebration, but also a solid recognition that there were some ugly stories, but also some really extraordinary stories of the native tribes still being here 400 years later, and of the progress of African Americans to freedom and to full participation in the politics and life of the country. So it was different from that sense, and Noonan got thinking, you know, Jamestown this is not just a Jamestown thing. In fact, it's not even a Virginia thing. It's a Chesapeake thing. Now, what can we do to turn this commemoration, this big event, into something that really reflects the whole Chesapeake Bay? And he thought, and he thought, and he thought, suppose we created a water trail for the National Park Service that follows Captain John Smith in all his explorations of the Chesapeake. And that indeed is what we pulled off. He enlisted a number of people early on. Will Baker, the president of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Gil Grosvenor, then the chairman of the National Geographic Society, DuPont Corporation, Chesapeake the Conservation Fund. And lo and behold, Noonan's pretty extraordinary leader. And long story short, on December 19th, 2006, which was the 400th anniversary of the day the Jamestown ships left Plymouth, England, George W. Bush signed this water trail into law. And it was quite a deal. Then we all had a lunch early in January at National Geographic and looked around at each other and said, my God, we got what we prayed for. What do we do now? What is this all about? And two questions about the water trail that we can start off with. First one is it open yet? The second is, how long is it? It's about 1,800 miles long. You see it up there on the chart. You've got it basically on this wonderful map that National Geographic created. And I'm going to ask you to open these maps to the green side and follow along as we talk about this. As you'll see, Smith's commission as a captain was actually not naval. It was a battlefield commission. But he turned into a really extraordinary small boat sailor. And if you look at the bottom of the green side, you'll see some drawings of a replica of the boat that he used to get around the Chesapeake and do his exploring in. She was about 30 feet long, rowed and sailed an early 17th century version of an English utility boat. And we figure that he put about 3,000 miles under that boat in 30 months getting around the bay. The 1,800 miles basically constitutes the distance that he covered, a line for all of the places that he went. 1,800 miles, that's a lot. How close are we to that trail right now? Right there. You'll see in a minute, to the eternal puzzlement of various good people in nice places around the Chesapeake, like Talbot County and Anne Arundel County, he never set foot in either one. Oh my God, how could he have missed Anne Arundel County? How could he have missed Talbot County? Well, there's a good reason why he didn't. But he went almost everywhere. And if you look on the green side, I'm going to ask you later what the difference is, what you see on the other side that is different. The other side is today. The green side is 1608. Let's talk about Captain Smith for a minute first. He was born in 1580 in Lincolnshire, England, son of a tenant farmer, and his father apprenticed him to a shopkeeper when he was maybe 15 years old, and it didn't take very well. And within a year, he had taken out on his own and gone to the Netherlands, today's Netherlands, to fight Turks and the Spanish. And as a soldier of fortune, as a mercenary. He got through that, spent a year doing that, and came back to Lincolnshire and spent 3 months living in the woods like Henry David Thoreau many years later, reading Machiavelli and the works of Marcus Aurelius. He's a pretty interesting dude. He's short and wiry at a time when people who were 6 feet tall were considered giants. He was, we think, about 5'3", but wiry and tough. And after he did his scholarly sabbatical, he headed to the Mediterranean and signed on to what is described as a merchant ship of doubtful character. She was a pirate ship. And they took a prize, and he ended up with money in his pocket, and he headed off into Eastern Europe and ended up hiring out to a Romanian prince who was fighting the Turks there. And he got captured and sold into slavery in Turkey to a princess who sent him to her brother, I'm not making this up, to be educated. Smith killed the brother and 2 other Turks in hand-to-hand combat, stole a horse, and escaped through Russia and Poland back to Romania, where his prince awarded him his battlefield commission and a whole nother purse of money, after which he went off traveling to North Africa and was back in England by 1608 or 1606 or so. At this point, remember, think about where he's been. He's been well over Europe. He's been into Asia, barely, but into Russia. And he's been to North Africa. That'll come back around. But also think about, he's tough. He can lead people in battle. He has killed people. He has lived hard. He has lived rough. He's a quick study. And one of the important things that he's learned to do, think about how many different languages he's had to contend with by the time he's 25 or so. He's learned how to communicate with people. He's learned how to communicate with people on a really broad set of experiences. He's looking for his next venture, and he signs on with the Virginia Company of London, which is a private stock company, to go to the New World. That sounds exciting. And England at this point, think about it, Queen Elizabeth has just died, but they have beaten the Spanish Armada. England is the strongest naval power in the world. They are rightfully very proud of their accomplishments, but they also have pretty well figured out that they know how the world works, the whole world. And they're very sure that they know exactly how the world works. And they want to go to the New World, to Virginia, which they know a very little bit about because of Sir Walter Raleigh's failed colony in Eastern Carolina in the late 1580s. They know there's a huge body of water over there called the Chesapeake that the Raleigh's people had told them about. And so they are ready to go. They know that Spain has found, the Spanish have found gold and silver all over the New World. So clearly they want to go and get their share of that gold and silver. And they're also looking for the Northwest Passage, which they absolutely believe exists through the New World to the riches of the Orient. So that's what the Virginia Company of London is about. It's about gold and silver. It's about the Northwest Passage. It's also about, is there a possibility of trading, economic possibility of trading with the native people? And we want to know what their military might is and what kinds of tools they've got, even though we're very aware that they are rude savages, heathens, and maybe we ought to convert them to Christianity while we're at it. Reality is not necessarily their strong suit at this point, but despite all of their naval prowess. So the ships leave Plymouth and head across, and they are made up of a group of a few naval officers, a number of noblemen of lower rank, but they're still noblemen in a very stratified society, and then some young soldiers and some artisans with various capabilities, sailmaker, fishermen, carpenters, people of that sort. There are about 125 of them, all men. And they head across the ocean. Now, Smith's in the middle of all of this, and he's a commoner, but he's been around and he knows a lot. And there are, some of the young nobles are not exactly ne'er-do-wells, but not people who had to work for a living. And they're figuring that they're going to go over there and get rich because they're not going to be able to come into the family lands. And they find Smith to be abrasive, and he doesn't know his place. And Smith, for his part, does not suffer fools gladly. And so by halfway across, he is confined. He's in the brig. He's somewhere. He is not totally free to roam the ship. The nobles have put the clamps on him. But they get to the first landing down here in what is now First Landing State Park in Virginia Beach. And they anchor the ships, the three ships, and they put that shallop, that utility boat, together. If you look at the drawing, we think it was made in two parts and shipped that way and then bolted together. But they put her to, well, you see her, they put her together and they go ashore. They have a brush with a couple of local Indians, but they open the sealed box of orders, and lo and behold, the Virginia Company wants Smith on the ruling council. So they have to free him, and they go on about their business. And a group of them, they go up in the river, they go up in this river here, the James, and start to explore it to put in a fort. They're trying to get far enough up the river that they won't be obvious to the Spanish who might be prowling around looking for them. And they're looking for a spot where they can bring the boats up close to the bank to unload. And they'd like to have an island that would be easy to defend. They explore all the way up to the falls, to the head of navigation. They actually find a village there that is run by one of the sons of the paramount chief of the region, Powhatan. And they come back down and they settle on an island that they call Jamestown, about halfway back down the river, that allows them to put the ships up close to the bank. That is, they don't talk to the native tribes about it, they just take it. And they start to settle in. It's not a great site for what they were looking for. It's got, it's far enough down the river. They have actually not been smart about consulting the Weather Channel and Google Earth. And they're in Virginia in the middle of a 5-year drought. So the river is saltier than it would normally be, more brackish, and they end up drinking a lot of brackish water, which has a physiological effect on them over time. And this is April, and they settle in, they start to move along, they run through the stores that they've got on the ships, and they're confronted with having to find food. The native people around there of a tribe called Paspahe in this region, and you'll find that on the map, begin to show them some things about how to fish and what they eat. The native people at this point are really sophisticated about how they live in this area. There are not a lot of them around. We think that in 1607, the total population, human population, of what we'd call the Chesapeake Bay watershed today was about 50,000 people, native people, and they were basically bone and stone and shell age tools. Very few metals, a little bit of copper that has come down in trade routes from Canada, but that's it. And they eat well, they live well. The English, though, some of the English say, we're not going to stoop to eat the food that the rude savages eat. We're Englishmen. And some of them actually starve. Some of them also say, well, I brought so-and-so with me to do for me, to take care of me, so don't make me work. And Smith said, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. This all goes on through the course of the summer. They do learn from the native people to fish in the river. They also learn that the lower part of the river's got oysters, especially down here in Kecoughtan, a native village that they meet, whose people they meet early on. And one of the major fish that they eat is sturgeon, which the native people have taught them to catch, to trap in shallow water and put ropes around their tails. These are big fish. These are fish up to 12, 14 feet even. And there is, we now know, remarkably, a run of sturgeon, a spawning run of sturgeon into the fall, into September. But things go along and they manage to get through the summer. A few people die, but they've got summertime food to eat. They don't do a garden or anything like that, but they do some trading with the Indians who raise beans and corn on their uplands around the villages. But come fall, they realize that they've got to find something. They need to put aside some food, especially dried corn. And they pick the most logical person to trade with the natives. That would be Captain Smith, to be sure. Remember his ability to communicate. And Smith goes trading up this river called the Chickahominy. How many of you all have, well, let's start at the beginning. How many of you all have heard of the Chickahominy River? Hot dog. How many of you have been up the Chickahominy? Where to?
I don't remember, it was a really long time ago.
Okay.
Somewhere up there.
Somewhere up there. Okay, anybody else been up the Chickahominy? Okay, but you've heard of it. Smith makes 3 trips up the Chickahominy in the late fall of 1607 in the shallop, in his utility boat, going up like so. And he comes back twice with a good deal of corn. The third time, he gets way up the river, and you might know this part. You might actually have been there if you have driven Interstate 64 from Richmond to Williamsburg. It crosses back and forth over the river, over the long bottomland swamp that is the Chickahominy. The Chickahominy drains from the north side of Richmond east and then turns south, and it winds back and forth. 64 runs right over it. Smith's way up there in this part of the river, and he runs into a hunting party that is run by a chief named Opashan Canoe, who is the brother and second in command of Chief Powhatan. And Opashan Canoe and his men, Smith's up there at this point. The shallop, the workboat, utility boat, is further down. They've hired a Chickahominy canoe, and they've got a couple of Chickahominy with them as guides and a couple of Englishmen. The two Englishmen get killed, the Chickahominy flee. Smith gets taken captive. Now, Opashan Canoe is fascinated, and this is a theme that'll go on. Opashan Canoe is fascinated with some of what Smith's got, particularly his compass. And this is the beginning of a realization by the native people, by the Powhatan people, that these paleface intruders have got some tools that they are interested in finding out more about. So they take him captive, and there is a story that some group of Europeans, probably Spanish, back in around 1600, had actually come up this river and killed a chief up here somewhere. So these guys say, well, we've got another one of these people from away, and I wonder if this is the guy who killed the chief. We're going to find out, because we're going to bring him to justice if he is. So they walk Smith around on a long, rambling tour. It's December by this time, and he stays captive for 3 weeks or so. He's captive while for Christmas and New Year's, and they get him up to that big river, which you've already figured out is the Rappahannock, and the folks up there, the Rappahannock people, look at Smith and say, no, this isn't the one. The guy who killed the chief was much taller than this. So they take him back down march him back down to Powhatan's capital here in Werowocomoco, right next to the Propetank River on the York. Now, by this time, he's been with them 3 weeks or more, and he's been all over this territory here. And the only thing that we know about what happened next comes from Smith's own writings, and Smith was a bit of a public relations man, trying to sell books and also trying to get people interested in coming to Virginia. So his absolute veracity is probably not there. But this is the time when supposedly Pocahontas, the young daughter of Chief Powhatan, pleads for her father to spare him when he's about to be stoned to death. The other possibilities for this whole incident are that what Powhatan was actually doing was putting Smith through some kind of a ritual in which he made Smith one of his war chiefs, because that's the ultimate outcome. Powhatan's interested in the tools, in what these people might be able to offer to his people. And he makes Smith a war chief and says, okay, I'm gonna spare your life and I'm gonna make you one of my allies. And Smith says, great. And that gives him, that empowers him, Smith, safe passage and to be able to go around and do stuff. What it means to Powhatan is, you're one of my people now, and you need to tell me what you're going to do and where you're going. Smith totally disregards that, of course. And these two basically play chess with each other for the next 2 years. They're both crafty, they're both very capable, and it's an interesting tug of war. The bottom line at this point in January of 1608 is that Smith goes back to Smith gets sent home back to Jamestown across the river and across the Virginia Peninsula back to Jamestown with some food to help the colonists get through the rest of the winter. And they do reasonably well, and spring comes and they start to plant some crops finally. They get a fort built. They are running into one problem. The water's brackish, and it's giving them trouble public health-wise, sanitation-wise. They do finally dig a well also. So by June of 1608, they're beginning to get themselves organized a bit. And at this point, Smith is basically running the colony. And he says, well, one of our assignments is to explore this great Bay of Chesapeake and figure out where the gold and silver is, what the natives' possibilities are, and we need to find the Northwest Passage. So in June, he picks 12 men, and they get into the shallop that he refers to as his discovery barge, and they take off. And I'm not going to take you through every single piece of it, but basically you've got that in the chart. And I'll tell you now, the best quick introduction to this trail is this map. It'll take you about half an hour to read it, but it'll pretty much tell you where he went and what he did in all of that time. We're going to sketch some pieces of it now. There are a number of books available, including an online boater's guide. Brad will give you information on the Herrington website and also in his newsletter for how to get hold of those materials, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. They drop down the river. They actually take a tow from one of the ships that's headed back to England, and they do a brief exploration outside of what they've named Cape Charles onto seaside eastern shore, and then work their way up the shore into the Pocomoke River, into Tangier and Smith Islands, where they meet a typical Chesapeake summertime thunderstorm, and their sail gets blown out and they get marooned on one of the islands over there, Holland's Island or Bloodsworth. God knows what they were using for sunblock or Gore-Tex or mosquito repellent. Mosquitoes, greenheads, sheep flies, they must have given a lot of blood while they were there. But they patch the boat back up and they keep going. And they end up in this river, the Nanticoke, and at first have a skirmish with the native people and then visit a king's village and sit down and have a really decent conversation. And they also get feasted, fed very, very well. You got to think they were not carrying freeze-dried food, and what they had available to them, they were not necessarily eating 3 square meals a day. These guys were tough dudes, rowing and sailing, making their way up these tidal rivers. Some of you may have, if you've been up rivers like the Nanticoke or the Chickahominy, you've already figured out that the currents are pretty strong up there, both flood and ebb. But they've made their way up. That's just part of what they do. And they talk with the Nanticoke people in a village that is close to the present-day site of Vienna, Maryland, on the Nanticoke, where some of you will know that is where Route 50 crosses the Nanticoke. And the Nanticoke chief tells them, and remember Smith's pretty good at language by this time. He's learned the basics of the Algonquian language. And they tell him about a giant-like people and a great water to the west and north. And Smith says, aha, that's it. We need to go. So they pull out, run through Kedja Straits and Hooper Straits, straight across to the western shore, to Colbert County, and they go right up to what Smith refers to as the first river large enough to admit a ship. That would be this one up here. It's interesting to look at what he did. He skipped Anne Arundel because we didn't have a river large enough to admit a ship. But if you look at what he wrote down, there's detail in some of his journals, but it's spotty. A lot of detail in some places, not a lot of detail in others. But the map, and we'll come back to this, but the top right-hand corner of the green side is a map that Smith and an engraver in Oxford, England, published in 1612. We'll be back to the map. If you look at the detail in the map, you can pretty much tell where he went, because in the places he didn't go, and notice here's how he managed to miss Talbot County, and most of Dorchester, and all of Eastern Bay, and the Chester. He didn't go in there because he wasn't interested. He was looking for the Northwest Passage. Simple as that. So he skipped that part of it all. They went into the first big river that they found, and they explored it all the way, as far as we can tell. Well, the detail on the map is very solid. He actually stuck his head, they stuck the ship into the boat, into the mouth of the Severn, because he details very well Greenbury Point and Spa Creek. And then he details the mouth of the Magathy. And there is some talk that he might have gone into the Magathy briefly. But he went into the Patapsco and went really all the way to the head of navigation. And this is a pattern that we'll see him follow as he goes along. It went all the way to Elkridge, which was the head of navigation at that point, and then explored up into the mouth of the Jones Falls, which we would know as the Inner Harbor today, and mapped it all. But they were running out of food at this point, and this part of the region appears to have been a buffer between tribes that were hostile to each other, and also set aside somewhat as a hunting ground. So there weren't a lot of native people here, which means that they didn't get fed by natives anywhere in this region. And it's early July and they're hungry and they get another big squall coming through, and they say, "We're tired." The crew says, "We're tired, we need to go back and restock because we haven't come to the end of this big water yet. We've still got more to do. We need to prepare and come back." And Smith gives them a rousing speech that regain your old spirits. I've worked as hard as you have. I've gone without food even more than you have. Come on, we can do this. And finally, with the storm shutting them in for a couple of days, he finally says, "Okay, let's go back and restock." And so they turn around and head south. But by the time they get down here, they have indeed regained their old spirits. And so they turn and go up this big river right here. And they go literally all the way to Great Falls, which stops them. They take the shallop up to Little Falls, tie it off, and walk till they hear the roar and see Great Falls. They meet in the process several of the native tribes, particularly the Patawomeck chief, who is here at his King's House village at the mouth of Potomac Creek, just above the 301 bridge. And they tell him about a silver mine. And so they go exploring. He goes with a number of guides up to the silver mine, which turns out not to be silver. And interesting to think about, way up at the headwaters of Aquia Creek, that's what it is today, they were actually on land that's now part of the Quantico Marine Base. And probably 300 feet above sea level, because the fall line, the boundary between the coastal plain and the Piedmont is right here. So they're up in rocky territory, all the way up looking for the silver mine. They spend time in various creeks along here. They meet native people, and he maps native villages all along here as well. And then they head back down, and they've actually been fed some. They've taken some food on. They've learned a lot. Smith has taken notes all of this time. And they work their way down to here, and actually to here. And they're thinking about continuing to explore, but they put up on that point where today the Rappahannock and the Piantank rivers meet. And Smith has this famous incident with the stingray, which is why it's called Stingray Point to this day. And Smith thinks he's going to die because he gets stung with a stingray. And if you don't know that story, it's on the map. But he is sporting himself, spearing fish with a sword, walking around in what we think is a shallow grass bed, as are his men. And he spikes a stingray, and the stingray gets his arm, and he gets so sick he thinks he's going to die. But then Dr. Walter Russell, the physician on the trip, applies a precious oil, and the pain subsides, and Smith eats his assailant to his supper. He ate the ray. But he's shaky enough at this point that he says, "Okay, let's go back. Let's go back and restock." And they turn around and go back to Jamestown, restock in 3 days, and are off again. And it's interesting that the folks in Jamestown seem to have been getting along all this time, but they don't know, obviously, with no cell phone towers, they don't know that Smith and company are even going to come back. So they're pretty impressed when Smith gets back, and he restocks, and then they take off again. This time they make it all the way to the head of the bay, and they end up in the Sassafras River with a tribe called the Takwo. That's the native name for that river, for the Sassafras. How many of y'all been in the Sassafras? Pretty good number, good. And the Takwo tell them about a giant-like people up in a great river. And Smith says, aha, and they go up into the Susquehanna, but they go up all the way to Port Deposit, to the falls on the river up there. And he realizes at this point that he's come all the way up, and this ain't the Northwest Passage. But he continues to explore. One of the things he asks the Takwo to do is to go up the river and invite the chiefs, the giant-like chiefs, to come down. And they meet on what is today Garrett Island in the mouth of the Susquehanna, which was a traditional meeting place for the people up the river and the native tribes down in the bay. How many of y'all been to Havre de Grace? Up around there. So you're aware of Garrett Island right there in the middle of the river. Garrett Island is actually an old volcano and got a very high top, so it is a great look-at point and a great meeting point, and maintained as a neutral meeting point, at least in 1608. So Smith says at this point, okay, we know what's going on here, and they head back down the river, head back down the bay, and this time they go into the Patuxent all the way up to, as far as we can tell from the map, all the way up at least to Lions Creek Wharf, where that is today, not quite to Wason's Corner. He's mapping villages all the way up. The furthest up village that he maps he calls Mattapanayant, and that is today the Merkel Wildlife Management Area of the Department of Natural Resources in Prince George's County. They come back, they go up the Rappahannock, they check the Northern Neck, they go up the Rappahannock all the way to Fredericksburg. There are they have several skirmishes, particularly right here under Fones Cliffs, and you can actually go there today and walk that battlefield. That's one that he details pretty carefully. And you can walk that battlefield in your boat today. And with a depth sounder and a GPS, you can figure out within about 50 yards where and how it all went down, which is pretty remarkable. Then he stuck his nose into the Piank Tank, didn't see many people, and went on back to Jamestown. And most of the rest of the travels for the time that he was there until October of 1609, had to do with trading back and forth in these rivers and with these tribes, and then up to Powhatan's capital a couple of times, and then up in the Mattapanna and Pamunkey rivers, the two rivers that form the York. He left in the fall of 1609. He was asleep on the boat with a crew, the shallop, somewhere up in the James River at night, and his powder bag at his hip blew up. It might not have been an accident. He, remember, was a fairly abrasive character, and he jumped overboard to put the fire out, but he was badly hurt, and he went back to England and never came back to Virginia. He did go to New England, and he's the one who actually named New England, New England. But what's his legacy, and why do we make such a fuss? Well, in the first place, if Captain Smith hadn't been here, there's a good chance that Powhatan would have rubbed the colony out. He basically was the leader that they needed for those first 2 years to survive in the New World. But the second piece is that map in the top right-hand corner. That is the first accurate map of the Chesapeake that was ever created. The next original map of the Chesapeake, created in 1674, actually had all the land cut up into counties with English names. How did all those people get here? You got it. That's the cruise guide. Right there. That's the chart book. You're looking at it. And the next question is, and you think about who came on it, a couple of examples. The Maryland colonists used it to get over here, to find their way into the Potomac. They knew they were in the Potomac because that's what Smith had named it, called it Patawomac. On the other side of the river, in 1655, a man named John Washington set up a plantation that he called Wakefield on Pope's Creek, where his great-grandson George was born 72 years later, 77 years later. And various other folks. Smith buttonholed a man named William Claiborne on a street in London in the 1620s and got Claiborne interested in Virginia. Claiborne came to Jamestown and was sent by the ruling council up to, with a trading license to trade with the natives going all the way north. And he actually set up a trading post on Garrett Island in the mouth of the Susquehanna, but he also set up a big post on this piece of land right here, which he named Kent. And he held that for Virginia until 1637, when the Maryland colonists burned him out, actually. And he took it to court in London, and the court held for the Calverts, so the Maryland colony retained ownership. But that's what opened up Smith, in a backhanded way, opened up all of Eastern Bay and the Miles and the Wye, and also the Chester. And there were English planters established up in those rivers by the 1650s. All of this happened because of that map. If you look at that map today, and you go, say, to the place where the Rappahannock warriors ambushed Smith on the Rappahannock at Fones Cliffs, you can look at that spot and know that you are where Smith marked that map. You can look at the native villages there and say, yeah, we're there. 411 years later. How did he do that? He didn't have a chronometer, he had an hourglass. He had a crude sextant that allowed him to shoot the sun, but he didn't have longitude. So his distances are off. Some of the GIS folks have done some really complicated work laying out Smith's map against current day maps to see how it all worked. And it's outrageously accurate. He got all of those twists and turns in rivers from the Rappahannock to the Patuxent to the Nanticoke. It's still just hard to figure. He was a master cartographer. One question is, what did he write his notes on? What did he write them with? Write in the rain paper? Put them in a Gore-Tex pouch? 200 years later, Meriwether Lewis, whose family, by the way, originally came to Virginia on Smith's map, Meriwether Lewis lost 6 months worth of his notes going to the Pacific coast. How did Smith do that? How did he preserve those? How did he write notes that accurate? How did he preserve them? If you look at that map hard, or a larger version of it, and then at a modern day map and a modern day chart, it's really extraordinary. But that's what his real legacy is, and this is why Pat Noonan pushed to have this trail out there. Now, why did the Bay Foundation get involved with this? Some of you may be familiar with this, our State of the Bay report, which we put out every 2 years, and which is really designed to say, how's the Bay doing? In a systematic and reasonably scientific way that's still built for normal people to read and listen to. If you look at the scores in here, you'll find that we scored it at 32 last year. It went down a little bit because of the extraordinary rain that we had. 33, sorry, went down a point. 33 what? What's the unit? What we're doing is comparing what we've got today with everything we can learn about the bay that Smith saw. And that's about where we are today. We've gone, as you know, and if you turn the map over, you'll find that one of the things that jumps out at you is that there are roads all over the place. The second thing I'd ask you is how much of the land on the green side is still in the condition it was in 400 years ago? And the answer is just about zero. We've been really busy over the last 4 centuries, and our population has gone from 50,000 to 18 million. But the next question is, do we take this bay as it is today, or could it be even more valuable to us? Well, some of us who have got some gray hairs on our chin or in our head remember other times when it was stronger, healthier. Some of us also remember that it's healthier now than it was 30 years ago in a lot of important ways. I don't know about you, I grew up in Richmond and I spent a lot of time around the District of Columbia on the Potomac, as well as the lower Potomac. And when I was growing up, if you touched the river in DC or you touched the James in Richmond, you had to wash your hands. You really literally had a public health issue. Same goes for Baltimore Harbor, same goes for the Elizabeth River and Hampton Roads. They're totally different today. Totally different. They've come back from the dead, even though they're still under a lot of pressure from human beings, and pressures that we never even foresaw 30 years ago. But should we be satisfied with what we've got right now? If we know that this bay was a lot healthier, what can studying John Smith's Bay teach us about where we might be able to go if we take care of it? What's a healthy bay worth to us? What's a healthy bay worth to you as boaters? What's a healthy bay worth to the economy of Anne Arundel County? Are there businesses that are based on a healthy bay? Yeah, you're sitting in one right now. And you're sitting in one that, as you know, has done more than most to respect the natural systems that make this bay tick. More power to Herrington Harbour for all of it does as one of the original clean marinas. What should we be trying to do? What does it really mean to save the bay? These are the kinds of questions that we've been able to ponder and work on. And one of the things that's really great fun about Captain Smith's Trail is that there are parts of it that are still, if not completely the way they were 400 years ago, there are parts that still look that way. They are not necessarily on the most common travel routes, although if you go up the Wye River, it's not hard to find some really beautiful territory. If you're in a power boat, and the issue is not depth of water, it's not draft, it's actually the problem for cruising sailors on some of these rivers is air draft, is getting under bridges. Basically what Smith did was go to the head of navigation on every one of the big Western Shore rivers. But some of the most fascinating stuff is up those rivers. How many of you in here have cruised all the way to DC in a boat? Pretty cool. I mean, that river's wide open to covering the whole thing in any boat. The James is open all the way to Richmond as far as that goes. Going up the Rappahannock, you'd be stuck at Tappahannock, but there's plenty of water all the way to Fredericksburg. I've had friends take Crogans up to 58 feet all the way up there. I mean, trawlers are naturals for doing this whole thing. The Nanticoke's wide open, except that there's a bridge in Vienna that'll stop a sailboat. The Patuxent's open to Benedict. And of course, going up to Havre de Grace and the mouth of the Susquehanna is fascinating. There's a lot of amazing territory. It can also be done in boats that aren't necessarily cruising boats. I've got a couple of friends from DC who are going to do a 6-day cruise on the Potomac sometime this summer on a 33-foot Grady Grady White that is sitting in Shadyside right now. And what they're planning on doing, since they're two old codgers like me, they're not planning on sleeping on the boat, although they may cook on it. But there are hotels and B&Bs all the way up the river. And one of the other possibilities with a couple of kayaks or even a skiff like my personal horse is a 17-foot whaler that's basically been all over this trail. There are launch ramps everywhere. And a 17 to 23-foot outboard will pretty much get you the whole trail if you want to. If you're really hardcore, you can paddle the whole thing. And there are people who have paddled huge chunks of it. Some of it is drop dead gorgeous. The Chickahominy is 21 miles of cypress and wild rice, and eagles and otters and a lot of fish. For example, it's one of the hidden gems. The Pocomoke is full of cypress trees. This part of the Rappahannock is full of wild rice and eagles, huge concentrations of eagles. There's some amazing natural stuff still out there. And we try to do justice to that and to help people explore it and know it and see what of Smith's Bay there is still here as an inspiration to go further. And we as boaters have got as much stake as anyone in a healthy Chesapeake. If we won't work for it, why should we expect anybody else to do that? That's the basic pitch for exploring this trail. Now, how do you do it? You can do it with a map. There are a number of books. There's a 182-page book by National Geographic with lots of photographs. It's basically the quick read after the map. This is where Smith went, this is what he did, and this is what you'll see if you go there today. The book came out 10 years ago. and it's available at Barnes & Noble. It's called Chesapeake Exploring the Water Trail of Captain John Smith. Typical National Geographic operation, really beautifully laid out. If you pay full retail for it, not buying from Amazon, it'll cost you $12.95. Barnes & Noble, Amazon, they've all got it. The next one up is a book that the National Park Service commissioned called John Smith's Chesapeake Voyages. That's about 400 pages and was written by a remarkable team of experts. The three principal authors are an archaeologist, a sociologist / historian, and a marine scientist. And there's a tremendous amount of background in there about the native people, the English culture, the state of the bay then, and the clash of cultures in where it all went on. And there's more. There's even a cell phone app that, there is a nuts and bolts boater's guide that is built for everything from kayaks to trawlers, including sailboats. And you can't buy it because it's a free ebook. It's online. Brad is going to put all of those into the newsletter. It'll be on the website, so all that information will be available to you. So what I would offer to you with spring coming is look at this trail and see if there's some spots on there that you've been curious about that you have not been to before. And think about seeing some new territory and seeing this part of the bay with new eyes. It's exciting territory, and it is still a beautiful place, and we can make it even better. Thank you for coming. That's it. I'm glad to hang around, drink more coffee, answer questions, take questions from the floor if you want, or go ahead and go back to the coffee pot. Thank you.